Janet, I want to talk a little bit about Catholic schools, and especially the whole question of parental choice, as we call it these days. But before I do that, I want to look back at your own job. You are the superintendent of Catholic schools, right? That is your title, official
That's correct.
title. Yes. I was thinking it has a rather public character to it, that more so than a lot of our other ministries. If you're involved in training Eucharistic ministers or something, it's a rather in-house business, or even being the pastor of a parish very often, as you're serving that faith community. But one of the more public positions we have in the Catholic community is the superintendent of schools, because our schools are so visible and are so much a part of the larger community, and there's an interaction between the public school world and the Catholic school world. So I wondered if there was anything about that you wanted to comment on at all, that public character of your job.
Well, we use the title superintendent because it's a parallel position, and I think the public understand when they say that you're superintendent, they understand that because of the public school superintendents. But the reality is that the job is really not the same as in a public school. Being superintendent of a Catholic school is more of a service to independently owned and operated schools in the diocese. So while we have over 100 schools, the schools very much function on an independent basis, and we try to act as a service organization for them, working with state mandates, working with diocesan policy, working with all kinds of other components that will assist them to run quality schools. But it really is not a parallel function as with the public schools.
Mm-hmm. And you also, that's an interesting point, you also have a certain public character, though. I mean, you're seen quoted in the paper and so on, and about opinions about things and so on.
That's right. It is. It's a public position, and I think it's because of our schools, obviously, are very much in the public eye and function that way, and education is important. And so I think we try to have a spokesperson for our schools in the diocese.
And it's also important to realize that most of our Catholic youngsters are not in Catholic schools.
That's
They're
right.
attending public schools, and therefore we must be very concerned about the quality of public school education. In other words, it's a broader reach for us, isn't it?
That's right.
And you, in part of your job, have to probably keep that in mind generally, this larger picture. In fact, what percentage of Catholic students would be in Catholic schools? I saw a figure recently, but I didn't believe it, and I don't know if you have that at your fingertips or not.
Of the number of our youngsters that are in Catholic, I would guess about 40-45%, maybe half of the students. We have a very large user rate in the Diocese of Toledo, probably fourth.
Are you telling me that 40% of the Catholic youngsters of a certain age, like say grade school age, would actually be in Catholic schools? Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we have to
Does that seem
check
high?
that. Yeah, we'll let the audience call in the right answer to that question. But anyway, that would be a high percentage, yes.
We do
but any way you cut it, there is a whole bunch of people who aren't in Catholic schools, and we have to be aware of all of that.
That's right.
Let me just try to take a little historical perspective on this, because as soon as you start talking parental choice, you're into a very delicate area. You're into the whole area of the public schools, the well-being of the public schools. You're in a question of how Catholics relate to the culture as a whole. And throughout our whole history, we've been concerned with this problem. And I think, just to rehearse a bit of that, in the 19th century, the public school system was gradually developed and formed, and from the viewpoint of the Catholic community, it had a strong Protestant evangelical tinge to it, so that it would be typical for the King James Version of the Bible, for example, to be read within the public school system. There would be Protestant hymns sung as part of the everyday activities. There would be prayer time and so on. And so in the Catholic mind, there was this general sense that these schools raised questions for us, the public school system, because they were seen as strongly Protestant and not always in accord with the Catholic sensibility. Now, as I read the 19th and 20th century, especially 19th century, you got two sort of reactions to that. One, represented by Bishop John Hughes of New York, was to say, we must build Catholic schools. We've got to have these Catholic schools because our students will be corrupted if they go to the public schools. They'll be turned into Protestants. They won't be Catholic. So he said, he had the famous phrase, first the school, then the church. That's what's most important of all. You must build these Catholic schools. We must get our kids into the Catholic schools. On the other side of that question were people who said, well, maybe that isn't the way to go, that what we've got to do is to try to get the public schools to be less Protestant and more open to our Catholic self-interest. So they would try to get, for example, different versions of the Bible to be able to be read, in the Catholic Bibles to be read, or less Protestant hymn singing. And to try to get the public schools so that they would be really better homes for Catholic students. And as I read the 19th century, it's sort of that kind of two different reactions to this great fact of the growth of the public schools in the United States. Now that whole attitude, I think, is continued all the way through to our own time. You get some Catholics who are, who say, well, the public school is now our home. It's not a Protestant school anymore. We've sort of succeeded in secularizing it, if that's the right word. We've moved into a direction where I can send my kids there and it's fine. Nothing's pushed on them that I don't want them to have, and I'll take care of their Catholic education another way through CCD or something like that. We also have our successors to Bishop John Hughes that I think have taken a different slant and saying, well, now those schools are too secularized and they don't learn religion in those schools. They don't learn values, and therefore we've got to attend to that ourselves. Janet, all of that just by way of maybe putting a little historical context on this question. We're talking about parental choice. Want to pick up on any of that, or want me to launch again?
Well, it's part of the history. I think for a long time, after the Council of Baltimore, Catholic schools, every parish was supposed to have a Catholic school.
1884, Third Council of Baltimore.
Yes. And I grew up in a time when you went to Catholic school. It wasn't discussable. It was just something that a good Catholic parent did. And then in the 60s, with the Vatican Council and with people like Mary Perkins Ryan, the Catholics began to wonder whether or not Catholic schools were really the value they were supposed to be, and maybe the best way to pass on religious education, that maybe there was a better way to do that. And I think we began to look at, should we be more part of the American culture and not be separate anymore? And I think for a long time we debated that issue and lost, and
probably still debated.
And still
in
debated.
many ways, yeah.
But I think many schools closed, and many parishes that were started did not form schools, did not build schools because of this kind of discussion. There are a lot of parishes now who have religious education centers rather than schools because they felt that this was the way to go. So for 20 years, I think we've been questioning the worth of our schools and the purpose, and I think the purpose has evolved.
Yes,
I think it is different. It isn't.
We've gradually articulated in better fashion the philosophy of the Catholic schools. Let me just stay with that history for a minute, because they go back to that Third Council of Baltimore in 1884. There were really strong statements made. There was preparatory commissions that did material for that, and they were moving in a position of saying things like this, that every parish should have a school, and then that every parent must send their kids to the Catholic schools. There was a lot of talk about under the pain of mortal sin.
That's right.
It was a mortal sin not to send your kid to a Catholic school if it was available. And that was strong here in the Midwest, in our own area, in Cincinnati and so on, where that was pushed very strongly. And so that's part of this whole history that we need to look at here, I think, that the decision was made. And remember, there was a poll of bishops back in 1884, or no, closer to the turn of the century, where the Vatican tried to find out where the American bishops were at on this question. And it came out that by more than 2-to-1 count, they were moving in the direction of saying, no, we want our separate school system, and we want it to be strong, and we want the kids there because that's where we're going to educate them in values and faith that we think they should have, and they're not going to get it in the public schools. Even though they're not as Protestant as they were before, that's changing. Still, we want our own. That was about over 2-to-1. The American bishops, I think, favored that kind of approach. And that's what mandated this whole effort to build the Catholic schools and to try to get parents to send their kids there. This is the place we would form them in the faith.
Mm-hmm. And I think some of the research, especially some of the research Father Greeley has done in looking back over the last 20 years of Catholic education, has proved to us that it does make a difference in the sense of the Catholic faith, in their attachment to the parish, in their receiving of the sacraments, that, maybe as we look back we can say, well, we weren't sure then, but now that we look at the research, we see that there is a difference in these youngsters.
And you can make a strong case from it, from empirical research done by both Catholic scholars and scholars of other religious backgrounds, and to try to make that case that the Catholic schools do a good job and make a difference, as you like to say. Let's just get another component. You mentioned Mary Perkins Ryan. She had written a book back in the 60s about asking the question, do we need Catholic schools or not? And I guess fundamentally her answer was that, well, we wasn't sure they were all that valuable and that maybe we had to go in other directions. And I think that spawned a whole debate within religious education circles about how you're going to do this. There was a lot of emphasis put on adult education at that time and said, well, unless you educate adults, how are you going to help the kids? That the real way, the family's the place they're learning all their values, and therefore what you ought to do is put greater effort into educating the adults, and there'll be better parents, they'll pass on the values, and this is the way to go about it. There was also a greater emphasis put then on other kinds of religious education, like CCD,
that's right, that's
Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, or on total family programs and so on. So that became part of the ongoing debate, too, up to our own time, about where you put the resources in terms of Catholic schools and adult education, CCD programs, and so on.
What is the best method of religious education,
Yes.
I think is the question. And in looking at what we have, I think both the research and I think the bishops would say, right now the best means we have, not the only one, but the best means we have for passing on the faith is the school. And until we find a better way, then we need to continue to support that effort.
And then one more effort to put a context in our discussion of parental choice. It has to do with our concern for the public school system as a whole. I mean, there's this strong sense that public schools are not doing well, that there's many people unhappy with them, that test scores go down. Professors at universities constantly complain about the quality of students that are being produced out of the public system as a whole. And I should make that a more blanket statement about any system, including Catholic schools. Often complaints about inability to read and write and to construct sentences that make sense, etc. You hear it all the time among professors. So there's a general sense to isolate this again, that the public school system is not doing the job it ought to do, and that Catholic people as a whole have to be concerned with that, because most of our Catholic students are in those public schools, and we have to be very concerned about the quality of work that's going on there. So this whole parental choice question is not, again, an isolated matter of getting students, getting help to pay for students going to Catholic schools, but it's a much broader question, it seems to me.
Sure. And I think there is a lot of discussion about educational reform right now because of the concerns you've cited, of the test scores and other things.
Okay, now let's look more specifically at this question of parental choice. I mean, one of the models for all of this is the GI Bill, at least as I see it raised, that after the war, the servicemen and women returning to the country were given the ability to their schooling was paid for, but they could choose wherever they were going to go.
That's right.
So if they decided to go to a Catholic college, the money was used to let them go to the Catholic college. So we have sort of, in some sense, a precedent or some model of what this thing might look like, although I think in other countries we would see it as well, the way it's done. But this idea of parental choice is the idea that parents would actually be able to choose which school their offspring go to, whether it would be public or private. And from our viewpoint in this discussion, saying that that would mean that parents could send their kids to Catholic schools, and it would not cost them the extra money and tuition and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain more clearly what the various plans are, or how this whole thing's supposed to work? Sometimes called tuition tax credit, isn't it?
Well, there are different ways. One would
Yeah.
be a tuition tax deduction,
Uh-huh.
or a tax credit, or a voucher.
Okay.
Right now, there's a program for preschool. And you talked about GI, which is higher education. Interestingly, there's a preschool voucher that a parent can get to send their youngster to any school, including a church school, a church preschool. So the choice, parents have the choice in the early, grades, before first grade, before kindergarten, or after 12th grade. It's just for some reason in between we haven't been able to look at that kind of choice. But it's really simply giving the parent a voucher, or using it through their tax deduction or tax credit, to use towards the education of their youngster. Now, it could be used towards tuition if they're sending them to a private school or to a Catholic school. It could be used towards educational books or equipment or computers if they're sending them to a public school. So it would be a voucher for every parent to assist in the education of their youngster.
And now this sets up a situation where there is choice. And
That's right.
And this also obviously sets up a situation of competition. And I know that in the public school world that there would be a lot of people who would be very opposed to this idea. And one of the things they say is that this is going to hurt the public school system. And it would seem to me that if the Catholic community is going to back some sort of voucher system or parental choice here, we would have to begin to try at least to respond to that kind of objection. I've read some articles along that line that are claiming just the opposite, that as soon as you set up a competitive situation, you're going to get improvement, and that the public schools would end up benefiting from this situation because they would have to continue to improve, to do a better job, maybe learn something from the successes found in private schools, etc.
I think one of the worries with public education, I certainly don't want to speak to all of their concerns, but one is that many of the students would then choose some other alternative education, and I think that probably would not prove to be true. Many people who choose public education choose it because they want public education. They might want to to move into other districts, and there is some open education among public schools right now in Ohio.
I don't know if I followed that. What did you mean there?
Some parents would want to move out of their public school district to another district.
To be able to go to another
And if they had
school.
to pay something to go to another district, this voucher would assist them in maybe going to a different district.
Without moving, you mean?
Without moving.
Yeah, it would be to their advantage.
Yeah, without
Okay.
moving geographically.
Okay, I see.
That might also be a help.
Uh-huh.
What it would do for us is certainly allow people who cannot afford Catholic education to have the choice of it, or cannot afford private education for that matter. My concern is that with tuitions increasing so often, our schools are going to not be able to serve the disadvantaged and the poor. And we do not want to be schools for the elite or for the rich. We've never been that. That's never been our history. And so if parents had some ability to afford through some kind of a voucher, they would have, I think, more of a choice for the schools.
Just to pick up on your point about that's been our history, it's really true, isn't it? I mean, the Catholic schools were the way that so many Catholic immigrants made it in
That's
this
right.
country. It became the great vehicle for it, and that was one reason why the Catholic community saw it as so important. It was the way of trying to educate people, to bring them along gradually. Very often they would learn Polish or German first in the home, and then in the school they would use it, but then they'd gradually bring them into knowing English and so on. So there was a a whole process there in which that system helped people to make it into the mainstream of the United States, and it was caring for people who were often looked down upon, who had to deal with the nativist prejudice, anti-Catholicism in the country, and so on, and often maintained at great price and sacrifice by the people, but mostly because they saw it as an advantage to them economically and socially. And I must say that our schools still carry on that kind of role today, with the 1/4 of the Catholic world that hasn't made it into the mainstream, largely Hispanic, that there's still the opportunity to help move in this direction of making it and being a full participant in this economy of ours. The other thing, Janet, I don't want to get off the question yet there of the public schools and their fears that it's somehow going to hurt the public schools if they would go with some sort of voucher system or parental choice. And one thing you have said is there, or I guess I've raised too, is that perhaps it will end up helping. I mean, not many people are real happy with the way public education is going now. I mean, there's a sense that we need to improve, and that and maybe it would be time to think more creatively, and that maybe the competition would help.
Well, I think if you look at the post office, if you want to talk about a monopoly, if you look at the post office, for years and years it was the only way of getting mail or packages or whatever. And once that was broken down and other companies were able to come in, all of a sudden the post office became a lot more efficient because of the competition. I think in that sense, I think it would be very helpful. I think there is some competition now, certainly between Catholic schools or private schools and public schools, but I think it's on an unequal basis simply because of the financial constraints, really, of our schools. And I think that probably would be a healthy change for all of us.
It sort of plays to a general American value of competitiveness, doesn't it? I mean, we often talk that way, that the marketplace will help, or that the competition brings excellence or helps people to make progress. It plays into one of our cherished ideals, I think.
Well, also the rights. I mean, I think when parents look at it and say, I'm paying taxes to support a public school program that I don't send my children to, and then I have to pay again for an education that's,
This is the other side of the argument, isn't it? Now it's to look at it from the viewpoint of the Catholic community and say, why am I having to pay twice? And then also there's the great financial problem, which has always been our concern throughout history. Our schools have always had trouble financially, and probably have only made them historically because of the generous service of the sisters, the religious teaching sisters, who very often worked, I think back in the 19th century, I saw some figures, worked for about $200 a year. And oftentimes didn't get paid. I mean, they were often the people who got put off, and
that's right.
And that's one reason we were able to keep these schools open and going. But now we're moving into a situation where we don't have as many religious sisters. They must attend to their own inner problems and care for the sisters who are older, and that becomes more and more difficult. Fewer younger sisters, and so the idea of sisters saving our private Catholic schools no longer obtains, can't happen anymore, so we have to pay people decent salaries, which we ought to anyway, out of justice. Ought to be a matter of justice. You factor all that in, and you got high tuitions. And now you got parents saying, I'm overly burdened to send my kids to the schools where I think they ought to go.
I think another difference is that our schools do follow state mandates. I mean, all of our teachers are certified. We do offer the same quality of education that's required by the state of Ohio, that the tax money, pays for in public education. We are inspected. We do follow approved courses of study. Yes, we obviously have the religion component and the faith component, but the fact is our schools qualify as acceptable education for the citizens of the state.
And so we want to cast this into, partly at least, into a role of rights, into that category, that you're seeing that the playing field is not level, that there's a sort of fundamental unfairness in the whole setup the way we have it now. Of course, the argument on the other side is, well, you want to send your kid to a private school, Catholic school, pay for it. Why should why should it be any other way? we've got a public system, send them there. That becomes, I think, of course, if that ever happened, if Catholic parents generally said, well, okay, next year we'll do that, well, we would flood the public system,
Yes.
wouldn't we? I mean,
Yeah.
we couldn't do that. I'd like to cast this thing, I suppose, in more of a cooperative mode. We live in an ecumenical age, and dialogue and collaboration where we would see our Catholic world as helping, say, how can we help the public schools improve? How can we work out a system of collaboration? How can we work out something so that we can make our own contribution and so on? I'd like to, instead of so adversarial, it would be better if we could get a more constructive dialogue going on this question. Of course, it might become part of the political campaign, too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's definitely very controversial, and I think many people feel threatened when we talk about opening it up and offering vouchers for everybody to choose whatever education they want. I personally believe that it will be better for all of us to do that. I think we would have to sit down and look at what kind of constraints that might put on our schools. Obviously, there's some obligations because of tax money, and that all of that would have to be worked out. It just seems to me that it is a more fair and equitable way for us to educate our youngsters. When we talk about democracy and we talk about freedom of religion, it seems to me that each parent ought to be able to choose what they want for their youngster.
Mm-hmm. Well, Janet, we've taken up a delicate and controversial question here, and I think that you've handled that well, befitting your public role. And I think that we've got a situation here. We're looking historically, and we've seen Catholics felt a need to build their own school system, and we understand from the side of the public school people that they're worried about their own the well-being of that system, whether it will break down. And we're looking at parental choice and saying, well, from many viewpoints, it could be helpful. It could bring better competition, improve the public schools. Certainly would be beneficial to the Catholic community if parents had that kind of choice.